First things first, what is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. They come in the file extension of .css, so unlike an HTML file where we use .html, for CSS, we use .css file extensions. HTML is the backbone of every single website, but honestly, it's pretty ugly. CSS lets us create beautiful and modern looking websites. How this works is CSS is a layer on top of HTML. So we write a regular HTML and then we make it look and act really, really nice by overwriting the default settings that a browser gives us with HTML. We can change all of that with CSS. So CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets, do not control the functionality of a website. So if you want to click a button and you want it to do something, that actually requires JavaScript. Now, JavaScript is definitely worth learning, but you should focus on learning JavaScript after you learn CSS. So you should learn HTML first, then CSS, where you currently are, this course, and then you should learn JavaScript after that. Now, if you don't know HTML, I have several HTML courses, the Ultimate HTML Developer, HTML 101, and HTML 201. So if you don't know HTML, please go back to one of those courses first, or do a little Googling and brush up on your HTML, because we are going to be working with HTML quite a bit here, because HTML and CSS work together. Lastly, CSS can be written in 3 different ways. Now, it all looks the same, but we can apply it 3 different ways. That's a better way of putting it. We have inline with the HTML style attribute, then we have internal with the style element, and lastly, we have external.css files. We're going to tackle all of these in this course. How does CSS work? In HTML 101 and HTML 201 courses, we talked about the different browser rendering engines. So your browser does 3 primary things. Well, it does a lot of things, but when it comes to rendering content, it does 3 primary things. It renders your HTML, it renders your CSS, and it renders your JavaScript. And in this course, we're going to be using HTML and CSS, so it's going to be using the HTML and CSS engines. And just as a little recap, these engines have different rules. So your HTML looks a lot different from your CSS, and your CSS looks a lot different from JavaScript. They have different rules, so we write code differently. And this is the same right across all programming languages, and this is called syntax. We'll talk more about CSS syntax in just a little bit. So CSS is really just a layer on top of HTML. We'll always need to write HTML to make a website, so technically CSS is optional. You don't need to know CSS in order to get a website on the internet. However, and I would argue this, if you want to make a modern looking website, CSS is not optional. You need to know it. Otherwise, your website's going to look like it's from 1997. So as a fun little experiment, go and Google the Space Jam website. It looks like it's from 1997, 1996, somewhere around there. Now, if you want to break into web development for a job, or you want to be a contractor, make a little side money, you 100% absolutely will need to know CSS, and you'll need to be pretty good at it. And this course is the perfect guide to getting started with CSS. Moving through this CSS 101 course, we will tackle the basics and most commonly used attributes. Okay, let's take a look at CSS syntax. So you should already have a text editor by now. You should have already downloaded and installed one when you were learning HTML. And so I'm going to open up my text editor called Visual Studio Code. And what I'm going to do is go to File, Open, and I'm going to open up an entire folder here. And I already have an index.html file. It's completely empty. There's nothing in it. And we can see all this did was give me a little sidebar here called Explore. You can always go to, I believe it's View and then Explore to turn this on if it's not there. You do have to open up an entire folder for this though. And I can open up this index.html file and do HTML:5, hit Tab, and it just fills everything that I need for me, which is really nice. And again, this is something we covered in HTML. So what I'm going to do is just ignore this stuff for now. And this is set to a Django template. Let's change this to HTML. And let's take a look at the CSS syntax. So there's 2 primary ways of writing CSS. You can write it right on an element doing the style attribute. You can say style color is equal to red. We'll talk about what color red and all that stuff is in just a little bit. Or you can, in your head section, write a style element. And in here, this is where you're going to write most of your CSS. It's going to look a lot like this anyways. So you have some sort of selector, And I'm going to make this even bigger here. You have some sort of selector, curly brace, the property name, colon, and then whatever the value is going to be, semicolon. And then if you wanted a second one, you could do like property2, colon, value2, semicolon. And so this fella here is always your selector. And from here all the way to here, this is called a declaration, where you have a property, a colon, a value, and then a semicolon. And always make sure you have that semicolon. And so this is what your declaration looks like. So whenever I say declaration, I'm talking about a property and a value together. So as an example, we could just go ahead and delete this, and we could say body, and that's going to target this body element. We'll talk about selectors and stuff a little bit later. I just want to show you what this looks like for now. Curly brace, we can put it on a new line if we wanted to, and we could say something like background color is equal to black. And let's go ahead and get rid of this. And I'm just going to load this page up in Google Chrome by going to File, Open File. I'm going to go to my desktop here, go to CSS 101, open up that index file that we were just working on, and we're going to see this background color is all black. And usually by default, it's white. And so this is what CSS does. It lets us do little things like this. So there's nothing to do, nothing to learn. I just really wanted to show you what the syntax looks like. Really, it's just some sort of selector. You're going to select like your body element, curly brace, closing curly brace, and between it we have a declaration, and a declaration is made of some sort of property type. Then it has a colon, and then some sort of value, and then a semicolon. And we could put another one on here on a second line. Color is equal to red if we wanted to. And then we could put a third one here, third value, and we could do this on and on and on. So again, nothing to learn. Let's go ahead and get started with that next lesson where we actually start diving into CSS a little bit more and get a little more hands-on with this. Okay, let's take a look at inline CSS. So from the last video, I just cleaned up this HTML a little bit, got rid of that old CSS. And when I refresh my page, it's a standard HTML page. Literally nothing on it. It is as plain as it gets. So let's go ahead and create an H1 element. So I type H1 and then tab in VS Code, and it creates an H1 element for me. And then I can say style is equal to, and then we can put some sort of element or a property or declaration in here. And we can see there's all sorts of stuff to choose from. This is all CSS, by the way, all of this. We're not going to learn all of this because that's going to take forever to learn, but we're going to learn the most commonly used things that will get you 90% there on pretty much every single website. So I'm going to avoid putting in a style just for now and say this is an H1, and I'm going to copy this down and create another H1. Again, I'm going to give this a blank style attribute. It's not doing anything at this point. This is another H1. And so when I refresh the page, we see an H1 and another H1. Nothing is different from HTML. However, in this style attribute, we can now say something like font size is equal to 10 pixels. We'll talk about font size in its own particular lesson, but I just want to show you that this is how we can write some inline CSS. So I go ahead and refresh this, and you can see that this is still an H1, and if I right click and inspect, in here, it's still an H1. However, it differs from this one. This is a base style H1, this one is an H1, but we gave it a font size of 10. Now, we could also change other things, like let's change the color of the second H1. Let's say the color has to be blue. And remember, I'm writing a declaration here. So I write the property name, colon, space, value, semicolon. And I can save that, go back here, refresh my page, and now it's blue. And we can merge these together if we wanted to. It doesn't have to be just one change at a time. If we wanted to add multiple styles or multiple CSS declarations, we can do a semicolon, because that semicolon tells the computer, oh, this is the end of this declaration. Look for another one. So we can say font size is equal to 20 pixels. And even though I don't have a space here, that would work, but I like adding a space and it just looks a lot nicer when you're writing massive amounts of CSS. So let's go ahead and save that, flip back to our browser, refresh, and we're going to see that this is going to be a little bit smaller, not quite as small as the first H1, but a little bit smaller, just like that, and it's still blue. And with my inspect tool open, and again, all I did there was right-click inspect, went to elements, select my H1 that I want to edit, and over here we can see we've got color. We can toggle this on and off. We can change this to, we can click blue and change this to red. And we can change the font size. And so we can toggle all of it off. This is what it looks like by default. We can toggle it back on, and this is what it looks like after our CSS. So effectively, we have written inline CSS. Now, this is a good way to get started, but it is not a best practice. So just keep that in mind. We are going to break this rule throughout this course, and that's totally okay. But in the wild, when you're writing real production style code, you're probably not going to use this too often. Okay, let's take a look at internal CSS. So in the last lesson, we wrote internal CSS, and that's just style is equal to, and then we wrote our regular CSS. We can actually pull this out and put it into internal CSS. So let's do this. In our head, let's write style. And then remember from, I think it was 2 lessons ago, we had a selector, curly brace, then we wrote the property, and then some sort of value. So this is a property, color is a property, 10 pixels is a value, blue is a value. So if we wanted to select all the H1s in this page, we can do that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to get rid of this, and I want to show you the before and after. So I just saved that, head on over to my browser, hit refresh, and we can see it's back to normal. Now what I can do here is I can change the selector to like an H1, and this matches the element name. So I can select the body, or I can select an H1, or a paragraph, or bold, or a div. I can do anything like that. Now we changed the color of one of them. We could say color is equal to, or colon, space, which is a lot like saying it's equal to. And then that value could be blue, semicolon, space, and then a closing curly bracket. And that whole thing here, this is styling all H1s on the page. So this is going to select every H1, this one, and this one, and it's going to say change the color from black to blue. So if we save that and refresh our page here, we're going to see that this turns blue just like that. Now we can add another one in here. We could say, let's target the body this time, and that's going to be our entire HTML element. We could say the body, and just for funsies, let's put this on a different line. We can say the background color is going to be black. And so we can see here that it does work on multiple lines. It's totally okay to have it on multiple lines. You don't actually need the spaces, although I would argue put spaces in there because it makes your code a lot more readable. And we're going to change all of the H1s to have a font color of blue. And then we're going to change the entire page, the entire body, to have a background color of black. And so we don't add a comma after this. We don't do anything fancy. The only way your browser tells or can tell that this is an H1 selector is this closing curly brace. Same thing with your body. It's going to say, oh, there's a body. Okay, open it, apply your styling, close it. And so let's go ahead and see what this looks like now. Now, within just a few minutes, we have actually started making style changes to our page. And this is internal CSS. Internal CSS is when you use the style element. Inline CSS is when you use the style attribute like we did in the last lesson. What I would like you to do is give this a shot. Go ahead and change your body background color. You don't necessarily need to know too much about this. Feel free to pause this video and just copy this text right into your document, and then open it up in your browser and see that it actually made a difference. Just get used to writing this particular syntax here, where you have a selector, an opening curly brace, your declaration, a closing curly brace. Okay, welcome back. In this lesson, we are going to be talking about selectors. Let's talk about selectors. I keep saying this word, selectors. So what I'm going to do is, just from that last lesson, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete this. and save that page and just refresh, and we can see that it undid everything. This is a base HTML page now. Now a selector lets us select different elements. So in here we've got two H1 elements. We could have a div in here, it says this is a div. We could have a paragraph in here. This is a paragraph. And if you're just joining me now, the way I made that little shortcut there was I type P, and as soon as you see this Emmet abbreviation pop up, you can hit Tab, and it creates your opening and closing tags for you, your HTML tags. Let's go down here and let's create a bold element. Actually, let's use the proper version. Let's use strong. And this is bolded text. This is normal text. And so when I refresh a page, we're going to see we have a standard HTML page. Nothing extraordinary is happening yet. But let's say we want to target just this one div or just this one paragraph, or we wanted to target all of the H1 elements on a page. We can do this with CSS. So we would use an internal style here. And let's say we want to select all of our H1s. So we have two on the page. We would say H1, opening and closing curly brace. And let's change that color to blue. Save, head on over back to our browser, hit refresh, and it changes it to blue. Now let's say I wanted to select just this paragraph and make it real ugly. We could do that too. We could say, select the paragraph, and you notice that these match the HTML element. So this H1 is literally the H1 element, and this P is literally the paragraph element. And let's throw this on just one line this time. We can say, make the paragraph background color. And what color do we want to change this to? Let's change this to, what do we have here? Dark magenta. Make sure you have that semicolon. Make sure you have that closing curly brace. Save. And let's go refresh, and we can see that this text is going to change. Hopefully that is a visual change that we can see in this video. Yeah, there we go. So we have something that's actually working here. Now this is a selector. A selector is the ability to select just particular elements. Now we can select it by an element, we can select it by a class, we can select it by an ID, we can select elements by their attributes if we wanted to. But we're not going to get into that just yet. We're going to tackle these one by one. So what I would like you to do in this video is make an H1, make a div, and then just target that H1 and change the color of it. I do not want you to change the color of the div. Let's talk about class selectors. In the last lesson, we were able to select all the H1s on a page, and we were able to change them. We changed the styling, change how they appear. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how we can select multiple elements using a class. So let's say we have an H1, select me, and below this we have a div, select me too, and we also have a paragraph, don't select me. Now there are several ways we can select both the div and the H1, but in this lesson we're going to look at the class attribute. So if I go into my H1 here, type class, then this is just HTML. We can change this color to blue, and we can also say in the div, blue. And so you see that how they both have blue in common. They're both a class. In our CSS, we can't type H1 and div, although we can do this. This is a different type of selector. We'll talk about this later. We just want to be able to select the H1 and the div, but we want to select it by the fact that they have this common attribute. They have this common class called blue, and we can do that with dot blue. And so I just made a selector here, dot blue, and you can think of class as dot. Now, if you ever watched the TV show called Reboot, you can think of dot is a classy character because classes are dots in CSS. It's just a shorthand method of writing this out. So now we have dot blue selected. It's going to select our H1 and our div. And in here we could say color is equal to blue. Save and refresh this page. And we can see that it says select me is blue, select me too is blue, don't select me is still default black. Now, what if I wanted to make this a little more complicated? Let's add a paragraph in here with some lorem. So I hit lorem, or I type lorem, hit tab, and it creates some lorem ipsum text. And if we preview, it's a regular paragraph. let's go ahead and select this, but let's make this H1 and the paragraph uppercase. So we can change this by adding a class is equal to, and let's call this uppercase. And this name is not super important, but I'm just going to call it something simple like uppercase. And let's also add a second class selector onto our H1. So we use space, uppercase. And you notice how these two now have something in common. We can go back up to our CSS and we can say class, uppercase, open our syntax there. We can do text transform, and then we have all these different options here. Let's go with uppercase. And let's save that. Let's go back to our page, and we're going to see that select me and this class, this element. So we can see that the H1 select me and this paragraph is going to be uppercase, just like that. So now we've selected this one and we've selected this one, but we have not selected select me to, the second one, or the last one. So this is a good example of how elements can share something in common, and we can apply styling based on that thing that they have in common. We also looked at how we can have two classes or more. You can have more and more and more in here if you wanted to. And the way we separate these is with a space. So we said the first class is going to be blue, the second class is going to be uppercase. So it made our first element here blue and uppercase. The second element only has blue, so we go up here. It only changes the text color to blue. And then in a paragraph, we're saying only uppercase, and it's only changing that to uppercase. It's not changing it to blue. Lastly, we have an element down here, don't select me, and there are no classes, there are no selectors for the P element to change all P elements. So this is just default, whatever the browser is going to give us. Oh, and one last thing here is these are case sensitive. So .uppercase is not the same as uppercase with a U. Make sure they are spelt the exact same. I see a lot of people throughout the years, I've seen them do something like this where it's uppercase and then this one is lowercase u and this one is an uppercase u. And they say, oh, it doesn't work for me. Why is it broken? It's actually not. It's just very case sensitive. So uppercase or even like blue and uppercase B is different. This is saying select blue with an uppercase B. So it is different. So just keep an eye on that. All right, let's take a look at ID selectors. An ID selector is a way to select something based on another HTML attribute called ID. And so we can say in this one here, let's make some space here. We can say the ID for select me is going to be the title. And we do this, we select this one with a number sign. And so in CSS, we can go back to our style element here. I'll just move that up a bit. We can do ID, the title, and this is case sensitive as well. And we can change this to have, let's say, text decoration of underline. So in the last lesson, what we did was we selected this element, and this element, and we applied different styling to it. In this lesson, we're going to select me by its ID, and we're going to give this an underline. So let's go ahead and refresh, and it's now underlined. And the reason that's not blue is because in the last lesson, I was telling you how this is super case sensitive. That was the case here. Let's go ahead and refresh this. Now it's blue, it's underlined, and it's uppercased. And we're using multiple selectors here. So this H1 element has the blue styling, has uppercase styling, and it has an ID called the title. And once again, that ID just starts with the number sign. The rest of the syntax is identical to an element selector, like what we saw originally, a class selector, like what we saw in the last video, and all it is that curly brace, your declaration, and then a closing curly brace. Now, one thing to note about IDs is they should be completely unique. So you can, in theory, write ID is equal to the title, just like we have up here, and this is going to select both of these because they're identical. And we should only ever have one ID. It's like your driver's license or your government ID, like your passport. There only should ever be the one document in existence. And just like an ID here, there should only ever be one. But we're saying that, hey, there's one selector, but it's being applied twice. Let's see what happens here. So you can see that our browser did not honor the rule. It actually made this underlined as well. Now that is, I guess that's fine, but please don't do this. What we should be doing is the title, and this could be like the subtitle. IDs should always be unique. Now, why this is important is because after CSS, you're going to be learning JavaScript, and JavaScript has the ability to grab an element by its ID. And if there are two of them, it's only going to grab the first one, and you might possibly want the second one, and that could really mess up your coding and cause hours of frustration. You don't want that. So always make sure your IDs are completely unique. Let's talk about grouping selectors together. So what I'm going to do is from that last lesson, I'm just going to go ahead and delete this code, and I'm going to delete the styling that we have here. Now, let's say there is a circumstance where you have an H1 on your page. This is an H1. You have a div on your page. This is a div. And you have a paragraph on your page. This is a paragraph. And let's say you wanted to select the H1 and the paragraph, and you wanted to change the color to blue. So currently, the way we know how to do that is we can add a class to both of these. So I can click here, and then in VS Code on Mac, I can do Command click, or on Windows, I think it's either Alt or Control click, and you can type in two places at the same time, which is really, really useful. And then we can do class is equal to blue. And that's what we did in the last couple of lessons. But we might not always have access to the class attribute. We might not be able to add anything to this, and there will be circumstances in the future where that's just not possible. So let's say we want to select this H1 and this paragraph. Well, currently we do H1 color is equal to blue. And then on a new line, we do paragraph color is equal to blue. And this does do the job. If we flip back here and refresh from what we previously saw, changes our H1 to blue and changes the paragraph to blue. Okay, cool, that works. There's a better way to do this, because you see how we have to write this twice? What if down the road, you have a CSS file or some styling, and it's like 1,000 lines long, and there's tons of selectors in there. What if you wanted to change all those colors from blue to red? Well, we'd have to go here, type red. If we forget one, oh no, now we have to go back and check. One's red, one's blue. We have to then find this one, go over here, change that one to red as well, go back, refresh our page. You can see how this can just get a little bit monotonous. Instead, what we can do is, let's put this on multiple lines just for readability. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to delete that. And instead, I'm going to group these selectors together with a comma. So I say select the H1, all the H1s on the page. Also, select all the paragraphs on the page. And we do that with, again, select the H1s, comma, space, then a paragraph. And if we wanted to select more, we could do comma, div. We could select all of them. Or we could do just the bold elements, or just the strong elements, or just the italic elements. We could do that. So what we want here is H1, comma, space, paragraph, or whatever element you want to select, space, and then a bracket. Don't make it end in a comma though. You don't want it to end in a comma. You can actually see that my my editor here has sort of ran into errors. You see those little squiggly lines underneath there? Yeah, it's running into some sort of errors. And so that error is just because I've got that comma there. So let's go ahead, save this, and when I refresh, we should see actually nothing has changed from this. Beautiful, nothing has changed. So this is red and this is red as well. So what I would like you to do is create 3 different elements on your page. Feel free to copy my experiment as well. Create 3 different elements like an H1, a div, and a paragraph. Select 2 of them, and then change the declaration. And then change the font color. And make sure that third one is not selected. Let's take a look at nested selectors. So there's a way to select certain elements that live inside of other certain elements. So I'm just deleting this code here, and what I'm going to do is create an example. I'm going to create a div, and in that div, I'm going to have a paragraph. So I type P, Emmet abbreviation shows up. I can now hit tab. Let's throw some lorem ipsum in here. And I'm going to also create another part that says this is bold. And I'm going to make this bold as well. So B. So strong. Let's go ahead, select that, cut, move to the end of the line, paste, and let's make something in here bold as well. Strong, go to the end of the line, cut, and let's go down here, paste. And what this looks like is this. We have a paragraph with some bold text, and then we've got some text outside of a paragraph. Look at this code real quick. This stuff is outside of a paragraph. It's inside the div, but it's outside of the paragraph. So we've got a paragraph here with an inline strong. Now let's say we just wanted to target me. Let's change this to target me. Well, currently, we know a few different ways of doing this. We could select all of the strong elements. We could give it a class. We could give it a class called selected if we wanted to, or we could add an ID of selected. Or maybe not the same one, not the same name as a class name. That gets a little confusing. Select me. Now we could add a class or an ID to this element. But when you work with frameworks in the future, such as Django, you might not have access to this right away. And so an easier way is to select it by selecting the div and then the paragraph and then this particular element. And so maybe let's just put this on a new line as well, make this a little more readable. And let's get rid of this stuff in here. So let's look at nested selectors. So currently we can select all of our strong elements and we can say the color is going to be blue. And this is great, but it selected this one. Maybe we don't want that one to be selected. Maybe we want just this one to be selected. How do we do that? We can do that without a class. We can do that without an ID. We cannot do that by selecting just the element because there are two different elements here. So what we can do is we can say target all paragraphs and then all the strong elements inside of a paragraph. And we do that by saying P space strong. So we have a P element here, paragraph, that matches right there on line 12. Space, not a comma, not a dash, nothing like that, just a space, then strong. And what's really cool about this in VS Code is you can just put your mouse in here, click, and if you look up here, it says strong P div body HTML. It tells you exactly where this element is living. So we just want to select all the paragraphs. So we're going to select every paragraph on the page. And then we're going to select every strong element inside of each of those paragraphs and turn it blue. And so when we save this and refresh our page, we're going to see that this one will turn black and this one will stay blue. Just like that. Now that is called nesting selectors, and we can go as deep as we want as well. So if we wanted to target just the ME here, we could say this is italics. And if we wanted to target just this one, we could say select all the paragraphs on the page, select all the strong elements inside of each paragraph, and then select all the I elements inside of each strong element. And so again, if I put my mouse there and I click I strong P in reverse order, that's P strong I. And you can see that it matches up here. And so let's go ahead and give this a shot. And now only this is blue. And it inherits the italics that our browser tries to apply by default. So that is nesting. I really want you to give this a shot. So go ahead and create something like this, where we have a div and a paragraph. Make this blue, and then have a paragraph outside of your div. Don't target this. This should not be blue. So I want you to target this one, but not this one. Don't use a class, don't use an ID, use a nested selector. Let's look at commenting code. In CSS, there's a good way to comment code, but it's a little bit different from HTML. So in HTML, and I'm just leaving off from the last lesson here, that's where I got this code from. In HTML, we have less than, exclamation mark, dash dash, and in here, we have an HTML comment. In CSS, it's kind of similar, kind of different. Same, but different, you know? So in here, in our style element, we do slash asterisk, and you can see it turned everything below here gray. And then we can say, this is a CSS comment. And to close it, we do asterisk, and then that same slash. So we just do it backwards. So this is the forward, this is the opening one, and this is the closing one. And this is a CSS comment. And so you can write what your CSS is doing. You can comment out your code like this. I'm going to do a shortcut way on VS Code. I can do command. It's command plus slash. On Windows, it's going to be control plus slash. And so I just go to this line here and I hit command or control slash, and it comments it out. So in the last lesson, what we did was we were targeting this little ME here. But because I commented that code out, my browser is now going to say, oh, okay, I know that there's code here, but it's in a comment, so don't execute it, don't do anything with it, don't even think about it, just pretend it doesn't exist. And when I hit refresh, we're going to see that this changes back to black, and it's still going to be italicized, but it's not going to be blue anymore. Just like that. And so code comments are really good for leaving your thoughts, your ideas, your to-dos. If you, let's say you're working for 2 hours tonight and then it's bedtime and you want to pick it up in the morning, you're going to see this a lot. To do a thing in here, something like that. Or if you're just testing out code and you want to comment or uncomment, you can always just test it out like this. And all I'm doing is commenting and uncommenting with command slash or control slash. Let's take a look at text colors now. Now, we've been working with this a lot. I think we're pretty familiar with how this works, but just leaving off from that last lesson, we're selecting P strong I, which is going to be down here, P strong and then I. We're going to target that ME. And let's make this really obnoxious so we can really see what we're working with here. Font size is going to be 50 pixels, and we're going to change that color to blue. So if I go back here, this is going to be a big ME. It's going to be blue. It's going to be italicized. We're going to see it just like that. But we've been typing names like blue or red, and we can see that if we type in color and then hit a colon, that VS Code is nice enough to give us all sorts of options in here. Now, these are nice, but when you're working with a designer, they're not going to be using these perfect colors. They're going to be using different styles. Or not styles, but very, very particular colors. So if we wanted to, we could have like black. Let's scroll up here. We have black. What about gray? How many different colors of gray are there? Look at that. There's light gray. There's probably something like a medium gray. There's all sorts of different types of gray in here. But we don't have to stick with just a name. We can stick with a hex as well. And so this is called a hex, and it's usually 6 characters or 3 characters. So it's like FFF, FFF. And you're going to see that VS Code has said, oh yeah, okay, that's white. We can do 000, 000, 000, and that's going to be black. Now, if the last 3 characters are repeating from the first 3 characters, we can shortcut it and just say 000 or FFF. Or if we wanted an eggshell white, we could do something like F5, F5, F5. These are 2 very common ways to add colors. Now, as you're learning CSS, it's totally okay to use like red, blue, black, gray, green, yellow, orange, whatever color you want to actually type out. But when you actually start working with a real design, it's going to be very specific. So it's not just going to be FF 0, 0, 0, 0. So that's red. It's not going to be the perfect color red all the time, because that's an obnoxious color red. Maybe it's going to be a darker red, slightly lighter red, maybe just an off shade of red. Your designer is going to be making that choice for you. And so you're going to want to make sure that whatever they're using, you can use. And so that's where hexes come in, hex colors. There's nothing to do in this lesson. I just wanted to show you that this is how these work. And you can have, again, a color, like a named color, or instead of black, you can have number sign 000, which is the same as 000. Okay, let's take a look at different color types. In the last lesson, we looked at named colors and hexes, but there's another one. Actually, there's a few of them. But the 3 you're going to be using for the most part are named colors, hex colors, and RGB/RGBA. And I'm going to show you what RGB and RGBA are in this lesson. So first things first, I just have a blank document here. Let's go ahead and create an H1 just because it's nice large text. And it's going to say change my color. And when I refresh my page, it just says change my color. So nothing fancy. Now I can select this H1 and I can say color is equal to blue. And it changes it to blue. Or I can say red, changes it to red. Or I can say change it to FF0000. That's enough, yep. And so that changes it to red. Again, nothing changes. Now there's also another way to do this. We can do RGBA. So RGB or RGBA. So RGB is red, green, blue, and RGBA is red, green, blue, alpha. Now let's do RGB first. So let's change this color to 125, that's red, 125 blue, and 125 green. I did that backwards. Red, green, blue, nailed it. And so let's see what 125 is. Now the highest number you can go to is 255, so make sure it's between 0 and 255. Let's go ahead and see what this looks like now. It's a shade of gray. It's about 50% gray. You're going to see this a lot as well, mostly when you're dealing with base colors like black, for instance. So 000, black is the absence of color in science, and that means 0 red, 0 green, 0 blue. Changes it back to black. Now, if we wanted to make this transparent a little bit, we could do RGBA, and as that fourth parameter here, we could say comma, and then instead of like 50%, we use a decimal. And so let's do 0.5, and that's 50%. And this is just like grade 7 mathematics, something like that, where 1 is equal to 100%, 0 is equal to 0%, 0.5 is equal to 50%. So this is going to be black, but it's going to be 50% see-through. So it's going to look gray, just like that. Now let's go ahead and change that background color of the body. We can say body, background color, and let's change this to red. And we're going to see that this probably isn't going to look gray anymore. It kind of looks a little bit see-through. So it kind of looks like a darker red just because it's black, but it's 50% see-through. And so it takes on the color that's behind it. Now again, when you're working with designers in the future, they're going to be using RGBA a lot, just because that alpha, that transparency, is really, really nice to work with. What I would like you to do is give this a shot. Use RGB and then RGBA. You might have to Google a couple of different colors. You can Google like, what is the color yellow in RGB? And then you can change the alpha with RGBA. Let's talk about links. Links are pretty ugly by default. They're usually blue if they're not clicked, and then purple if they are clicked. So I'm just going to clean this code up from the last lesson here. Give us some room to work. And so let's say we have some lorem ipsum in here, and we wanted to make a link. We could do this. href is equal to https caleb.io. And let's turn this into a link and some extra white space. And so, because we know in HTML, white space doesn't matter, let's refresh our page and we can see we have all of this in one line and there's a link. Now this link is purple by default because I've already gone to caleb.io. If you haven't gone there, it's going to be blue. So let's go ahead and change this. So we can select this link with an A element because it's the only link on the page, so we can select it and it's totally fine. We don't have to worry about multiple links with multiple styles. And we can say the color of this is going to be red. And when we refresh our page, it's red. Now that doesn't look very good. Let's start making things look a little nicer. Let's say that color has to be black. It has to fit in with the rest of the text here. Okay, so that looks a little bit better. But what happens when I click and hold? Depending on your browser, that can actually change. What we want to do here is we want to be able to change these states, these link states. So now what we can say is A, and you can see when I do 1: after the A selector, it gives me all sorts of things to choose from. Some of these are pseudo selectors, some of these are just regular selectors. Let's go ahead and use hover. What happens when we put our mouse over the link? And so the syntax for this is our selector and then our state. And when we hover over this, let's change the color to blue. So I just saved that, and when I go back to the page, you can actually see nothing happens. When I refresh, however, I'll put my mouse over it and it's going to turn blue, just like that. So now we have some sort of interactivity using just CSS. There's also an active state, so A, active, and that's when you click and hold. So when you do click and hold, let's change that color to red. So let's save that, refresh our page. When I hover over, it turns blue. When I click and hold, it turns red. So these are the different states of a link. We're saying by default, make it black. When you hover over it with an action with your mouse, make it blue. And when you click it, make it red. The last one we have here is visited. So we could say any link that has been visited, change the color of that. Let's change this one to something that's gonna be really hard to see, but very noticeable, yellow. And because I've already clicked this link, right? I click it, takes me here, I go back. Because I visited this link already, it's now yellow. And these are the different link states. So go ahead and give this a shot. I want you to create a link on your page, change the default color, change the hover color, change the active color, and change the visited color. I want you to experiment with these and get a little bit of experience with it, because you're going to be using this probably every single day as a front-end web developer. All right, let's take a look at font sizes. So font sizing, we've actually worked with this a little bit. All I'm going to do here is create an H1 and put some lorem ipsum in there. And when I show you the page, yep, that is pretty obnoxious. But we can change this. And let's give this a class of small. That's just what we're going to call it. And so we can say select all the H1s on the page with a class of small. And this is new. This is a new selector. We haven't seen this yet. So we're going to select every H1 and then make sure we only select the H1s out of that group that have the class of small. And we can do font size, and let's make this like super tiny, like 3 pixels. So I'm going to save that, refresh, and it's super tiny. I'm zoomed in quite a bit too. I'm at 200%. If I zoom out to 100%, yeah, you can't even see that whatsoever. 200%, you can barely even see that. So that's how we change the font size. And that's the font size declaration. So it's font-size, space, and then your measurement. Now we don't use a measurement like 3 because 3 is not going to do anything. If I do this, refresh, it's almost like nothing happened. And what I can do here is comment this line out. So it's as if it doesn't exist. Refresh the page and we can see that nothing is happening. And that's because I gave it an improper measurement type. So I said 3, or I could say 3 pixels, and that's actually going to do something. Let's go ahead and change that to like 30 pixels. Okay, it's a little bit smaller. What happens if we said 75 pixels? This is going to be huge, just like that. So that's the font size. There's not really much to do here. You've probably already worked with font size in one of the previous examples already, just because I was using it as a way to example other things. But if you haven't used the font size declaration yet, go ahead and give this a shot. Don't forget to use pixels. There are other measurements, but we're going to talk about measurements in the next lesson. Okay, welcome back. Let's talk about measurements. So in most CSS, not all, but most, we are going to be using measurements such as pixels, ems, rems, things like that. So these are all different types of measurement styles. But for the most part in this course, we're going to be sticking with pixels just because it's the easiest to wrap our head around. For funsies, if you really want to level up your CSS game right now, you can always go off and Google what an EM is, an M, and you can always go and Google what an REM is, rem. But throughout the rest of this course, we are going to be sticking with pixels just because it's a little more absolute and easier for us to understand at the very beginning. And again, this is a CSS 101 basics course, so we want to stick with just the basics for now. But even when you're working with a designer, a design is going to come in and it's going to say that something has, for example, a height of exactly 50 pixels. And so you might want to be using pixels for the most part anyways, instead of ems or rems, just because it is a lot more absolute. So there's nothing wrong with using pixels. We're going to be using pixels moving forward. But if you want to level up your game, you can always Google what an em is and what a rem is. Background colors. Okay, let's save this page. This is a blank page. And when I refresh my page here, we see absolutely nothing. Now we've worked with background colors a little bit, but let's go ahead and start making our page look a little nicer. Let's actually start working with some stuff that we can keep. So I'm going to select my body element, and I want to give this a background dash color and then a particular color. Now I know I want off-white, and this might be a little bit hard to see at first, but hopefully when I do the transition, it shows up in the video. So this is just regular white, and if I refresh, you can see it's a little bit off now. Now what I can do is I can always right-click, inspect, click my body, and you can see the background color is F5, F5, F5. What if I wanted to change that to red, F00, or black, 000, or default white? Doesn't do anything. F5, 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 and this is what it's going to look like when I toggle this on and off. So white, off-white, white, off-white, something like that, just so it's not as hard on the user's eyes. We could also do something a little darker, F0, 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 and we can toggle this on and off as well. So now we have a very light gray color. So that's a background color. You can use a hex color, you can use a name color, you can use an RGB or an RGBA if you wanted to. We learned about color types already, so feel free to use any color type you are familiar with. Background images. Let's go ahead and add a background image to our page. Now a background image has slightly different syntax. We can say background image, and we do image. In HTML, it's img. In CSS, we actually type it out, it's image. And this one isn't just like website.com/img.jpg. Not quite like that. It's very similar, but not quite. Instead, what we do is URL braces or parentheses, and then we put the link in here. Now, this can be a relative link. This can be an image that's in your same folder, or it can be an absolute link. And we learned about those in HTML, so you should be familiar with pathing and absolute and relative links by now. Now, I don't currently have an image. Let's go ahead and grab an image. I'm going to go to unsplash.com. And let's go ahead and grab this cool image, because this is pretty nice looking. Let's grab that original size. That's going to be a big image, but let's grab it. And I just put that image into my CSS folder. So it's right beside my index.html. And it's called background.jpg. And you can see in VS Code it shows up here. And when I click it, we can actually see what it looks like. So that's pretty cool. And in the URL, I'm going to say background. I'm going to have to make this just a touch smaller. Background.jpg. And that's going to link, and VS Code is actually smart enough to use this one, but it's going to link to this one over here. And this is a relative link. So let's go ahead, go back to our page, and even though we have a background color, the background image is going to take precedence. So let's go ahead and refresh. And, well, we don't see anything because that image was far too big. So let's go ahead and try to contain this image now. We can do background size, and VS Code is going to give us options there, like we saw. Contain or cover. Let's go with contain and see what the difference is between contain and cover. So save that, refresh. And it looks like the image is showing up over and over and over again. And in fact, you know what, this might have actually been too big of an image. So what we can do here is, let's just go back to Unsplash. Let's grab a different image, something that's going to be a little bit, I want it to look cool, but I also want it to be smaller. So let's grab this photo of Chewie here. Let's download a smaller image, a small one. So now I have two background images. I've got background.jpg, I've also got chewie.jpg. Let's open up VS Code. We can see it in here. This is Chewie. I purposely downloaded a smaller image. And let's go ahead, comment this out. Let's just backtrack a bit. And let's type in chewy.jpg, that matches the name over here. And with a standard background, there we go, that's better. And we can actually see it's repeating over here a little bit. Let's get rid of this. And that's totally okay. So now let's see what the background size contain does. It makes this image contained in the body element over and over and over and over and over again. What about cover? Cover makes sure that the image takes the entire width, the entire spacing of the entire body element. Now, what's cool about this is we can say div, stuff here, and we can change this from a body to a div. So let's select our only div on the page and refresh. And we can see that it's sort of starting to show up there. Let's go ahead and give this a height as well. Just for funsies, let's do 300 pixels. There we go. We can also give this a background color of something darker. Let's do 000. But we have to move this onto the body. So now we're getting into a little bit of refactoring. This is completely normal. You're going to be doing a lot of refactoring as you start to write more and more code as well. So now we've got a background color of black. We can see the image in here. And it's going to take up as much space as it can from this element. So if we change this height from 300 pixels to 100 pixels, we only see basically the sky. Let's do 200 pixels. And we can see just their heads. Let's change that background size from cover. Let's change it back to contain. And so what this is going to do is try to take this whole image and it's going to contain it in here. Now it's repeating because we want to see the whole image, but it also wants to by default take up as much width as possible. So let's go ahead and change that background repeating. We can do background. Nope, not color. Repeat. And then we can repeat on the x-axis, y-axis, or no repeat. So let's say repeat on the, no, it's already repeating on the x-axis. Let's go ahead and say no repeat. And now we have an image on a page using a div. And this is a common practice. You're going to see this a lot. There is no image element. It's just the background. Now let's see what happens when we go in here and we change this to our old one, background.jpg. We can see that shows up in there as well. And let's just go ahead and undo that. And so this is background images in a nutshell. You have your background image, your URL to whatever resource. You have a background size, contain, you have background repeat. There's also things like background positioning. So we could do background position, and this is going to take, oh, look at all these different measurements. CH, CM, EM, EX, FR, IM, all sorts of things in here. But these ones, we actually want to use the named ones. Let's go ahead and say center on the left axis, or the X axis, left and right, and then center on the Y axis. That's top and bottom. And now we have an image that is perfectly centered. And what you can't see over here is our text still shows up, but we've just centered that image. Now, what I would like you to do is go to unsplash.com, grab an image, any image, change the background size, change how it repeats, change its positioning as well. And if you need a little bit of help with that on a div instead of on a body, you can always just set the height to like 200 pixels and you can make sure that the image actually works on your page because it's all about positioning. That's really what background images are about. It's about specialized positioning. Let's look at the inspect tool. We did this in our HTML 101 and HTML 201 courses as well. We can always right click on the page and go to inspect. And this is really important because we can click on an element like a body and we can see the styling. So I clicked on right click, inspect, make sure you're in the elements tab, and then in the sub tab, you want styles, not computed or event listeners, you want styles. And then I just select the body and it's got a background color. I can toggle this on and off, or I can change it if I wanted to. I could change it to red, make it really obnoxious. I could even go in here into the body itself and I could say color is equal to white. And let's change that background color back to black. And all I'm doing is clicking around here. So I click in here, it lets me create a new declaration, new property and value, or I can go in here and I can just click white, edit it, or I can go in here and change the color from color to background color and overwrite it. Background color. And to toggle these on and off, all we have to do is click that checkbox on and off. Now, where this gets really handy is in that last lesson, we set a background image on this div. Now, what if you don't know all the values? And because CSS has a lot of properties, it also has a lot of values. And a lot of this comes down to sort of memorization and understanding where you can get your answers from. So you have a background size here. I'm just going to click on contain. It selects it for me, delete. And now I can go to auto, contain, cover, and I'm just toggling through these. I'm just hitting my down arrow and we can see what these look like. So we have 3 main ones here. So auto is the same as initial, as revert and unset, but contain and cover are different. So we can see what we're looking for here. Now, why this is important is because if we go back to contain and we wanted to change the height, we could do this. We can make that height bigger and bigger and bigger, and we're actually not going to see too much here. But we can make it smaller, and that's just because my inspect tool was in the way. And there we go. I don't know why it made height a second time for 201 pixels, but all I did was click on the original 200 and go up or down. I'm hitting the up arrow or the down arrow. We can also change this to something massive like 3000 pixels, which is going to be huge. Or we can change the height to 300 pixels. And if we want to experiment, that's cool. We can absolutely do that. We can toggle it on and off, see what the default is. We can do all sorts of things. And if you're ever like, ooh, you know what else is there? You can always just type in background and you can see all these different things. There's background attachment, blend mode, clip, color, image, origin, position, position X, and position Y, repeat, you know, it goes on and on and on and on. There's all sorts of stuff in here. And so if you're ever like, oh, I want to learn more about background images, for example, you can absolutely do that by going into your browser. And the nice thing about this is you don't actually need internet for this whatsoever. You don't need to be able to Google it. You don't need to be able to Bing search it or look for an answer on Stack Overflow. You can do all of this right in your browser. Now, the last thing to note is I'm going to change a few of these things. Let's say I get rid of centering and I change it to be this. If I hit refresh, it's going to go back to the default value. And that's because we didn't actually change anything in our file here. This file is untouched. What our browser essentially does is takes a copy of our index.html file and renders it, and then says, oh, this is the stuff that was rendered. Here, you can play with it. It's a sandbox, it's a playground. So when I hit refresh, it's going to go back to the normal page and I'm going to lose my progress. So usually what I do is I'll change something in there and then I'll take all this, copy it, copy, and then I'll just throw it in here and paste. And then I'll just fix up sort of the syntax here to make it a little more readable. And you can see that it's exactly what we have written already. So that's how I make changes in the browser and then copy it into what I actually want to keep. Moving forward, we're going to be using the inspect tool a lot. And moving forward, you're going to want to rely on the inspect tool to see everything that you can possibly see. Let's take a look at text alignment. So let's say we have an H1 on our page. Hi, my name is Caleb. We can select this H1 and let's do this with an ID. So we've got an ID of intro and we can say, select the H1 with an ID of intro. And in here, by default, this is going to be aligned to the left. So let's refresh our page from what we were working with and it's aligned to the left. Now let's say we wanted it to be centered or to the right. We can absolutely do that. All we do is text align and we can say center, justify, left, right, start, inherit, initial, or unset. We want center. And so when we save this and refresh our page, it's centered. Now, a cool thing we can do here is we can just go up to our element, right click, inspect. Make sure you've selected that H1, and where it says text align center, we can change this. So this is what center looks like. End, initial, inherit, justify, left, revert, right. There's all sorts of stuff in here. The ones that you're probably going to work with is going to be left, right, justify when there's enough text. And we're not going to get into that one, and center. So left, right, center, and maybe justify. In this lesson, what I want you to do is create some text, use like an H1, and change that text alignment to be centered. Then open up your inspect tool and change it to be right, like that. Now, if you are writing HTML and you've been writing the center element, no longer use that. You can rely on CSS instead. It's better to use CSS than to use the center element. If you have not been using the center element, please ignore that. You saw nothing. Once you are done that, let's head on over to that next lesson. Let's take a look at borders. So borders are really, really important. They are the primary way that we separate our content from other sections of content. It's how we make things stick out sometimes too. So let's go ahead and create a new div. This has a border, and let's give this a class of red border. And so let's go up here and we can select all of our divs. And when we select all of our divs, let's make sure we also select the divs that only have a red border class. Now we can give this a lot of different border values or properties. We can see there's tons of them in here, but we're really only going to be working with 3 of them. We're going to be working with border width. So border width of some value. We're going to be working with the border style of some value. And we're going to be working with the border color of some particular value. So let's say the width is going to be 5 pixels. The style, we have lots of styles to choose from. So it can be like solid, or let's see what we have here. Solid, dash, dotted, double, groove, hidden, none, outset, and ridge. Let's go with dashed. And the border color is going to be red. Or if we want to use a hex, it's F00. Let's go ahead and refresh our page, and what normally wouldn't have a border now has a border. Now this is really nice for 2 reasons. A, you now have some styling around here. Granted, this is kind of ugly styling, but we do have some styling. And the second nice thing is we can see that this border takes up all this space, so we know for a fact that this is a block element. We learned about block elements in HTML 101 as well. Now there's a shorthand way to do this. We can also say border. We can give it a width, then the style, then the color. So we can say border is 1 pixel, solid black, and because programs read things from top to bottom, it's going to say set that width, set the color, set the style. Oh, but actually, not because it's shorthand, just because we've basically rewritten this a second time down here as shorthand, it's going to accept this one. So it writes this to your page, but it's so fast, when it gets a new rule, it says, okay, overwrite that. So now when I refresh the page, this is going to have a 1 pixel border black. All right, continuing from that last video, what I did here was a border width of 5 pixels, border style of solid, and border color of red. So it's this ugly red border. Let's go ahead and make this really atrocious. Let's see if we can really make this obnoxious. 50 pixel width border. Yeah, that's pretty gross. That's honestly too gross. Let's do 15. That's a little better. So in this lesson, we're going to be talking about border radius, and we can do border radius as the property, and then it takes some sort of value. Now, typically you're going to be working with either pixels or percents. So let's do a 10 pixel border radius. And what this is going to do when I refresh a page is it's going to make a nice little angle here, a nice little radius, just like that. Now we can apply this to images, not just borders. We can apply it to anything, any element out there, as long as it has some sort of hard edge. Well, luckily, every element in HTML is made of some shape of rectangle, so they all have hard corners, and you can apply a border radius to everything. Now, what if we didn't want the border radius to be 10 pixels? What if we wanted it to be as round as it could possibly be? Let's do 50%. That's looking pretty gross, and you know, it's good to know that we can do things like this as well, because there is a place and time for this. And I'm going to show you right now how this sort of works. Now, this looks disgusting, but what if we said this element has a width of 200 pixels and a height of 200 pixels? Now, it's going to be perfectly square. I'm going to comment this out. And this is going to be perfectly square like this. Let's move that down. And we have a red square. Now, if I uncomment the border radius, we can see it's a perfect circle. So now there is a place and time for a border radius that is super obnoxious, like 50%. Now, what I would like you to do is create a new div on your page, give it a border, some kind of border, give it a border radius of 50% or 5 pixels or 10 pixels or 1 pixel if you want to be like really, really elegant about it. Give it a width and a height so that you have a perfect square, and then just fiddle around with it. So give that a shot, pause the video here, and when you're done, hit resume and we will learn a little bit more about border radius. Okay, so this is border radius, and what this does is it applies the radius to the left, the top right, bottom left corners all equally. And I commented that out, so we're not going to see that anymore. Now, what we can do is we can specify an individual corner. So we can say border top left radius is going to be, let's say, 5 pixels. Border top right radius, let's make this one obnoxious. Let's make this 50. And let's do border bottom right radius. Let's do this one as 5 pixels. And the border bottom left radius. And now we have something that looks a little bit like a leaf. So now we're starting to make shapes, which is really interesting because all this is a border. And what I find to be kind of peculiar is if I right click on this element, go to inspect and hover over this, you can actually see it's still a square. Your browser thinks this is a square, but the CSS engine then renders it to not be perfectly square. So what I would like you to do now is try to fiddle around with the border top left radius, top right, and bottom left radius. Now, if you're feeling really spicy and you want to go one step further, we can always do border radius, 5 pixels, 50 pixels, 50%, 5 pixels, 50%. And what this is going to do is top left, bottom left. And that's going here, 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 and then down here. And that's going to go in a clockwise order. Go ahead and have some fun with this. This can really spice up like your own profile, your portfolio page, if you will. Let's look at display. So in HTML 101 and HTML 201, we learned about different block types. And so in H1, this is a block element, and a span, this is an inline element with more text beside it. And if we do with more text beside it, we're going to see something very interesting. So when I load up my page here, this is a block element. This is H1, and you can see it's taking up all this extra space over here. It's a block element. It's selfish. It wants to use as much possible space, even if it doesn't need it. And you can tell that it's a block element because even though this is a block element and we wrote with more text beside it, it kicked it down into its own line. Whereas a span is an inline element, and it said, you know what, I'm only going to take up the amount of space that I actually need. And yes, other elements and other text can live beside me. I'm totally cool with that because I'm not selfish. But block elements are kind of selfish and they take up all the space that they possibly can. Now with CSS, we can overwrite this. And this is really important because you're going to see one element over and over and over again, and that's the div. The div element, this is a block element. The div element is a block element. It's going to be selfish. It's going to take up as much space as it possibly can. And so let's say we have these two block elements and we want these to be side by side. We can do this. We can overwrite this now with CSS. We can say, select both divs on the page, and we can say display, and its default behavior is block. But we could say display inline. Let's also give this a border, 1 pixel solid red, so both of them have a border, and we can see where we're working. In fact, actually, let's back that up just one sec. Let's change this. Let's comment this out. These are block elements. It's taking up all the space that they possibly can from left to right. Let's change the display type to inline, go back to our page and hit refresh. And they work side by side. Now, why this is important? Well, there are probably 1,000 different use cases, but the most popular use case that you're going to see is div. Divs are block elements, but they're also dummy elements. They don't actually mean anything. So you're going to be overwriting display block from a div to display inline or inline block. Now Now, here's the difference between inline and inline block. Okay, this is a very important thing to distinguish. Is on our div here, if we said the width was supposed to be 200 pixels each and the height was supposed to be 200 pixels each. And actually, this is really cool. I didn't know that VS Code does this, but this tells me here that the property is ignored due to the display. With display inline, the width, height, margin top, margin bottom, and float properties have no effect. So now we're getting into internal rules of CSS. So when we go back to our page, it has absolutely no effect. Now, to get around this, we simply say display inline block. And when I refresh the page, we can see that they turn into proper squares. So what I would like you to do is fiddle with this, because this is vital for working with CSS. I want you to create two divs, and then I want you to make them side by side. Use display inline and then inline block, and set a width and a height on both of them. Make sure that they can be side by side and that they are two squares, just like I did in this video. Give that a shot. Once you're done, let's head on over to that next lesson. Let's talk about width here. So let's go ahead and create a new element. I'm going to style it first, and then I'm going to give it an element. So let's select a div that has a class of half width. And here we can say the width is going to be 50%. And I can actually read this and create something out of this. Now watch this. This is really cool. In VS Code, I can do div dot half width and then hit tab, and it wrote my class out for me. So basically I just wrote CSS, hit tab, and it wrote out the HTML for me. That's really cool. That's called an emmet abbreviation. This is half width. And so when I refresh the page from the last lesson, doesn't look like much is happening, but in my inspect tools here, my developer tools, you can see that it's actually taking up half the width here. And if I scroll all the way down, I can select that inside here, and it's only taking up 50%. I can change that too. Let's go ahead, change it to 90%. And now you can see it's taking up 90%. Now I find that hard to work with, so what I like to do is add a border. So I do border 1 pixel solid red, and this just shows me what I'm working with here. So when I refresh a page, it went back from 90% to 50 because I was just fiddling around in the developer tools, and it doesn't save your work there. So I changed that width back to 50%, gave it a border, and we can see what we're working with here. Now we can also give this a width of something a little more solidified. So 50% is 50% of your browser. So if you shrink your browser down, and I'll show you what I did there. Let's go back, right click, inspect, and I'm using Google Chrome for this. Click this little icon, toggle device toolbar, and we can see when we toggle this that the width is always 50% of the page. It's never ever going to change. It's always going to be 50% of the page, even if that page is super tiny. And this is 300 pixels wide, so this is a very small mobile device. Or we can say, let's say 500 pixels, and when I refresh this, and this is pretty hard to see, I apologize for that, it's always 500 pixels here. Always, always, always. And so when I do this, we can see it's always 500 pixels, and when I do this, the box itself actually isn't getting smaller. My viewport is getting smaller, but watch this. When I get small enough, it bumps on over. So that's really hard to see. Kind of a terrible example, but there are two different ways to specify a width. Now, the thing to know about width is you need to have display inline block or display block set, one of the two. It's important that you have one of the two set, because if you set display inline and you set a width, VS Code is already complaining here. Let's go ahead and get rid of that view. Inline is only going to take up the minimum amount of width that it possibly needs. It's not going to understand that you want a width of 500 pixels. So to get around that, we do inline block. That works. We can check this out. We can see that it only takes up 502 pixels on my screen, or we can do block. Same thing, 502 pixels on my screen, but it also takes up this extra white space there. Now we can do the same thing without a div. We can change this to a span. Let's get rid of display block so it's normal thing. And let's go ahead and change this to a span. So span, half width, 500 pixels, 1 pixel solid red border. Well, a span is an inline element. We can tell it's an inline element because the width is not being set here. We can also tell that it's an inline element because if we go here and just hover, it's using the minimum amount of space possible. But we can overwrite that. We can say display inline block or display block, and this will now accept width. Height. Let's talk about height. So we talked about width in the last lesson and how it works with inline block and block elements, or how it doesn't work with inline elements rather. So I'm not going to go over that again. If that was sort of beyond your understanding when I just said this about 10 seconds ago, definitely go back to the lesson on width where I talk about the different display types. So let's go ahead and give this a height of 500 pixels as well. Height 500 pixels. And you can see that this is actually getting easier for us. We've spent a little bit of time together. We know that this is a property, this is a value, this is a selector, and we can have multiple declarations in here. And so width 500 pixels, height 500 pixels. We don't really need to go over like what height actually is in like the English language. We know what it is already. And we know that width works one way, so height should probably work a similar way. So we're speeding up how fast we can learn CSS here, which is really nice. So let's go ahead and refresh this page and get rid of that. And we have this big square. Now that might be too big. What I'm going to do here is select that 500 pixels, go to selection, add next occurrence, and now I can type in two places. Let's do 250 pixels each. Save that. Now we have a square. Now, as a quick recap, width and height are only going to work if you have display inline block or display block set. It's not going to work with inline, because I'll show you, just doesn't work with inline. Inline is supposed to be side by side, takes up the least amount of space. It's very, very polite. Whereas inline block and block are a little more selfish and they take up as much space as they possibly can, or as much space as you tell them to. Box shadows. Okay, this is a really, really cool one. So let's go ahead and create a new box here. And I'm going to actually get rid of all of this and let's delete that and delete that. And let's create a new element on our page with the ID of box. So BOX, and I hit tab because it shows Amit abbreviation, shows me what it's going to be. And that's all I'm going to do. Now I've got a div. We know it's a block element and I can select that ID with box. And I can say the width of this box is going to be 200 pixels. The height of this box is going to be 200 pixels. And the border is going to be 1 pixel solid black. And let's not make it 1 pixel. Let's make it 2 pixels. And we're just going to see a black box on our page, just like that. Now what I can do here, and we're going to start using a lot of components together, is I can add a background image. And let's add the URL. And let's add Chewy in there. Let's say the background position has to be center and center. And let's say background size needs to be cover. Let's see what this looks like now. Okay, so we filled it with a background image. That's pretty cool. Let's go ahead and add a border radius of 0 on the top, 50% on the top right. The bottom right is going to be 0 and the bottom left is going to be 50% as well. So it's going to look somewhat like a leaf, like that. And I think I might have said that backwards. So this is top left, top right, bottom left. Now with a box shadow, we can say box shadow, and this is a very interesting one. So we want the x-axis, the y-axis, and the color. So on the x-axis, let's move this over 10 pixels. On the y-axis, let's move this over 10 pixels. And the color, let's make this red, just so it's obnoxious. And we have some sort of box shadow. Now, that's not bad. I don't mind that. But let's say, we didn't want such a hard line there. Let's say we wanted to blur it a little bit. We can say x, y, and then as a blur value, we can say, let's say 5 pixels of blur, and then change it to red. And we can see that it gets a little blurry there. We can actually make this significantly blurrier too. Let's do 15 pixels. There we go. Now, that sort of suggests that there's like some sort of light over here. Let's go ahead and change that x to like 2 pixels. So that's going to move right 2 pixels, and then it's going to move down 2 pixels, the y-axis. And we have some sort of glow back here. So that's looking pretty good. Now there's one other thing we can do. Let's go ahead and get rid of that blur. And that's what our border looks like. We can also say inset. So give it a box shadow on the inside, so it looks like it's a little bit hollow. Look at that. So that's not bad. Now that's red. Let's go ahead and add 444, 444, so a dark-ish color. And let's change these 2 pixels and go to selection, add next occurrence. Let's make these 6 pixels each, inset, and a dark gray color. There we go. It's working on the inside. And we can also blur this. So before inset, we can say 5 pixels. So we can say move it on the x-axis, 6 pixels, y-axis, 6 pixels, blur every pixel by 5 pixels. Inset means the box shadow is going to be on the inside, and then we set the color. And let's go ahead and refresh, and we can see now there's some form of a blur in there. Let's go ahead and make that blurrier. There we go. And so now we're sort of working with all of these individual components or these declarations. We're making it bigger into this bigger image component called a box. And it's called a box because I gave it the ID of box. It doesn't have to be called box. We could call it leaf. And we'll see nothing changed. So again, your box shadow goes X, Y, blur, if it's inset or not, and then the color. What I would like you to do is give this a shot, create a square. You don't have to do all of this stuff, but create a square, let's say 100 pixels by 100 pixels. Go ahead, give that a box shadow, set your x-axis, your y-axis, your blur value, make it inset and not inset, so toggle them on and off, and then add a color. All right, let's talk about padding and margin. Padding and margin are 2 things of the same coin. They're 2 sides of the same coin, but they do different things for a different reason. So let's go ahead and start off by creating a box. And this box is going to have a width of 100, not 100%. That's way too much. Let's do 200 pixels. Height of 200 pixels. And a border of 1 pixel solid, nope, dashed blue. Something like that. And all I want here is some sort of box to show up. And so in here, I can type div box, and it creates a box for me. And look at that. Standard box, nothing fancy. Now, when I right click on here and go to inspect, I can actually see that this is a block element. It's taking up all this extra width over here. But if I scroll down in my styles area, so I clicked on elements, clicked on my element, the box, click on styles, and scroll all the way down, we can see that there's padding, margin, and border. And so this is our element here. It's 200 by 200. It's exactly what we set it to be. Then there's padding. That's spacing on the inside of the border. Then there's the border itself, and then the margin around it. So let's talk about padding. Padding is going to be on the inside. So we can do a nice example like this. So example of text. There's a weird way of saying that. Refresh this page, and it says example of text. Now, if I wanted to add some padding so that my text doesn't hug that border, we need some sort of spacing on the inside, and that is called padding. So we do padding, and let's add 10 pixels, and that just sort of widens it. It widens the gap between the content and the border. And if we scroll on down, we can see that our inner content is still 200 by 200. The padding is 10 pixels on either side, on all 4 sides. We have a 1 pixel border, and there's no margin. Now, a lot like with our border radius, and I'm going to add that padding in here, padding 10 pixels. A lot like our border radius, we have top, right, bottom, and left. And we can actually see that in here. We have top, right, bottom, left. And there's a shorthand way of writing 10 pixels, 15, 20, 30. We could change all of that. So we could say, let's first of all comment this out. We could say padding 10 pixels, that's the top. Then let's do this. Top, right, bottom, left. It goes in clockwise direction. So 10 pixels on the top, 15 pixels on the right, 20 pixels on the bottom, 25 pixels on the left. Refresh our page and we can see that, yep, it definitely did something over here. And when I click this and go over here, we can see top is 10, right is 15, bottom is 20, left is 25. And so that's how we add spacing on the inside of an element. This is very, very, very important. In the next lesson, I'm going to talk about margin, which is essentially the exact same thing, but the spacing doesn't live within the border. It lives just outside of the border. Let's take a look at margin. Margin is a lot like padding. However, padding is inside of a border and margin is on the outside of a border. So carrying on from our last video, our last lesson, let's go ahead and add a margin of 30 pixels. And when I go back to my page and hit refresh, this isn't going to say dash. This is going to say 30, 30, 30, and 30. So refresh, and there we go. It's 30 all the way around, and it gives us 30 pixels all the way around. Now, we're going to see something weird here. Is it's also saying the margin is also all this area. That's because it's a block element. Let's go ahead and change this to display inline block. And you're going to see that it actually respects the margin 30 pixels all the way around. Let's go ahead, scroll to the bottom so we can see that it's taking effect on the bottom as well. And again, where it says styles here, you can just scroll on down and it will show you what it is. And just like padding, it doesn't have to be just margin 30 all the way across. What we could say is, let's copy this. And I just copied that whole line. Margin, so we've got top, right, bottom, and left. And now we can see 10, 15, 20, 25. That's exactly what we told it to do. Now, a really cool thing, if you ever want to center an element, is we can do margin. Let's say we wanted margin auto. And what this is going to do is automatically center this for us. And actually, I forgot a thing. It needs to be a block element. So this one needs to be a block element. And that's why it reserves that extra space all the way over here. That block element is reserving that space in case it needs to move around a little bit. So when I hit refresh, we have now centered our block element. And if you want to give it a top and bottom margin, we can always say margin dash top 50 pixels, margin bottom 50 pixels. And there's a shortcut way to do this as well. We could also, or alternatively say, margin top 50 pixels, right auto, bottom 50 pixels, left auto. And we can comment this out as well. Go back to our page and refresh, and that top margin's been applied, but it's still centered in the middle of our page. Okay, let's talk about max width. We have been working with width quite a bit. Let's go ahead and use max width. Now, max width is not necessarily going to be used on every single element, but it is going to be used on, let's say, an inline element. So let's say we have some sort of element with an ID called inline, and it's going to have a, not a width, a display inline block. Let's go ahead and create this element. Inline, hit tab, and some text here. And let's also give that a border so we can see this. Border, 1 pixel, solid red. And so we see this text here. Now we can say, because it's an inline block element, that it should only ever reach a maximum width before the text breaks onto a new line or overflows. So when we say give something a width of, let's say, 500 pixels, it's going to give us a width of 500 pixels. But let's say we wanted it to be flexible. So it can start off this small and it can get up until this size. We would use a max width. So let's go ahead and add a max dash width. And we're going to see that the width actually changes back down to the minimum size. And in our tool here, our developer tools, we can right click inspect. And let's add a bunch of text. So I'm just going to copy all this stuff in here and we're going to see something very interesting. This doesn't take up the entire width. This takes up 500 pixels, 502 pixels actually, because there's a border on the left and a border on the right. They're both 1 pixel, so 502 pixels in total. And what we can do is, because we've selected this element, we can say that max width, let's click on that and let's go, see, we're making it bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually the text is going to start getting a little bit shorter and wider on the page. That's what max width is. So a width is a hard set value. So we're saying the width has to be like 500 pixels, but a max width can be anything between 0 and 500 pixels, or whatever you set that value to be. It doesn't have to be 500. It could be any value. Now, you're likely not going to use this too much in your project, but it is good to know about. So there's nothing to do in this particular lesson. In the next lesson, let's go ahead and get started with opacity. Opacity. All right, let's talk about making things see-through with opacity. Or is it called opacity? I don't know. I've heard people say it either way. So for this, we sort of need to start layering our page. So in our body, what I want to do is add a background image. And I'm going to set the URL to be Chewy. Let's go ahead and refresh our page here. And we have this image of Chewy. I don't really care that it's repeating right now. We could totally touch that up if we wanted to. We know how, but I want to create a box somewhere on the page and be able to see through it. So let's go ahead and create a new CSS element. Let's give it an ID of box. And it's going to be display block, width 200 pixels, height 200 pixels. So now we have a perfect square. We could do margin. We know how to do this, like we know how to make this centered. So we could do margin auto, and that will center it for us. Or we could say margin top is going to be 50 pixels. The right is going to be automatic. So it's going to center it for us. And because I only have two values in here, it's going to repeat these two values. So it's going to be top, right, bottom, left. Let's go ahead and add a background color of black and make that text color white and text align center. And you can see we're starting to really piece all of these things together. And I'm going pretty fast with this. Let's add a padding of 25 pixels as well. And so what we should see here is in the middle of this page, we're going to see a 200 by 200 block with some white text, black background box. But before we do that, we actually have to add the box to the page. There we go. So it looks like I'm censoring the dog. That's funny. Did not mean for that to happen, but that's still funny. So what we can do here is we can actually make this transparent. Now there's no text in here. Let's go ahead and talk about Chewy real quickly. Hi, this is Chewy. He's an amazing doggo. White text, padding's kicking in, text is centered, things are looking good. But let's say we actually wanted to see the dog and we didn't want to censor him. What we could say is opacity. And instead of saying like 100% or 50% or 10%, we use a decimal. And so 100 is always equal to 1. And 0 is equal to 0. And 50 is equal to 0.5. So a quick little math lesson there. So let's say we want this to be 50% see-through. We could do 0.5. And now we can actually see through it. Now, what we can't see is this text is also transparent. Now, this is one way of doing opacity, and this is going to change this entire box to be not transparent, but translucent. It's going to be 50% see-through. Now, we could do this a different way and make that text, make sure that it's not see-through. So, a good example here would be color is equal to red. And that's not really red, that's pink, and it's because it's 50% see-through. Let's go ahead and comment out that opacity, and let's change that background color to RGBA. So we're going to do 0, 0, 0, and 0.5 for 50%. And this is going to change a background color, but that text color is not going to change. It's not going to be 50% transparent because we said, hey, the whole element has 100% transparency, but the background color, just this one declaration, has 50% see-through rate. And there we go. That text is a little more bold, but that background didn't change. So there's two ways of doing opacity here. You can use RGBA, which a lot of people are going to do because opacity is going to change the entire thing to be translucent. Or you can change the entire thing to be translucent using opacity. Now, what I would like you to do is experiment with this. You can even use this exact same code that I've written here, but I want you to experiment with this using RGBA and opacity. And remember, because we're using translucency or transparency, we're making it see-through anyways, we want to use a decimal, not a %. All right, let's take a look at external CSS. This is very, very important. So far we've been writing all of our styles inside of a style element. What we can do is we can throw all of this into an external file. So we create a new HTML file, not an HTML file, an HTML element called link. So I just typed link, hit tab, and it created a rel style sheet. And this is the relationship of the linked document. So we're saying, hey, browser, there's going to be another file that you need to go and fetch for us, but just so you know, it's going to be a style sheet. And then the href is going to be the name of the style. So we can do style.css. Now, just taking off from that last lesson, if I right click inspect and go to console and then refresh my page, we're going to see 404 error file not found. Style.css does not exist. And that's because we don't have a file called style.css yet. So what we can do here is new file, style.css, and it's empty. There's nothing in it. So if I go refresh my page, that error doesn't show up. So my browser now knows that there is an external file being pulled in and it's being pulled in properly. Now there's nothing in there, but what we can do is we can say, grab all this stuff and cut. We can get rid of our style here. And we can go to our style.css and paste. And we can get rid of that comment, that's not needed. And just save that file. So we save both files here. And now we've cleaned up our index.html file. All of our CSS is in its own .css file. Refresh the page and everything works perfectly. Now, if I were to delete everything out of this page would be pretty boring. But if I were to put everything back into this page, it has a little bit of life, a little pizzazz now. Now, at first you're probably thinking, well, why on earth would I do that? What's really nice is you can create another index file or another file. We'll call this second.html and some other text in CSS 101. Let's change this to second page. And so now we have two HTML files. We've got index.html and second.html. If I go back here, index.html works. And if I go to second.html, this works as well. Actually, that changed my zooming level. There we go. So when I flip between the two pages, I get all the same styling, all the same goodies, but I can change my text, I can change my content. Now again, where this gets really, really powerful is if you have 100 HTML files, you don't want to be writing style and then going in there and being like box, yada, 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 and copying and pasting that 100 times. That will drive you nuts. And that is no way to live your life as a web developer. Instead, we throw everything into an external file and then we link to it. And now I can change, let's say I can get rid of the background image on style.css, and it's going to take effect on both index and second.html. So let's go back to our browser, and I'm going to hit refresh. This is on second.html. We can see that up here. I got rid of the background. And if I go back to index.html, I got rid of that background as well. And all I did was commented out in one place instead of two places. And so it's a lot more efficient to write your code like this. Now, there's another benefit is when you are serving your website, your browser can actually cache this entire CSS file, so it doesn't have to download it every single time you view a page, and it's actually significantly faster. So it's good for your users as well. So the preferred way to write CSS is in a CSS file. I just called it style.css. You can call it literally anything you want .css, as long as it has that .css in there. Now, I really, really need you to give this one a shot. This is very, very important. This is, again, a super vital part of CSS and HTML and how they link together. So in your index.html file or whatever file you're creating, I want you to add a link. Take all of that styling, throw it in your style.css. Notice how there is no style element in here. There's no style element whatsoever. And then take your insides, the inside of this element. So you had a bunch of stuff in here. Take your selectors, cut them, and put them into your style.css file. So make sure that works with an external file. And then after that, I want you to level that up, copy this file into like another one called second.html, and make sure that your CSS file loads on both pages at the same time. All right, let's take a look at floating elements. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna comment out this box, and I'm gonna keep my external style sheet linked to my page. So I'm gonna write code in style.css, but I'm not going to delete this. I wanna keep this because maybe I wanna use it some other time. But I'm gonna leave or make some extra space to work here. And what I wanna do is demonstrate floating elements. And so a floating element is this is very interesting. So we can have a paragraph, and we could put lorem in here, and we could copy this paragraph over and over and over again. Let's go ahead and copy this over and over and over. Actually, nope, that was wrong. Let's back that up. Let's add a line break. Let's do this way. We're gonna have a lot of text in here. And let's refresh our page. And so you can see that style.css is still working for us. Actually, let's go ahead and comment that out because that's going to be counterintuitive to this lesson. There we go. And so we have all this text in here. And now the idea of floating is when you have an image, you can put an image somewhere in here, and you can either make it float to the left or float to the right. And that's going to make your text wrap around everything. So let's go ahead and add an image, and I'll show you what a normal image looks like inside of a big paragraph like this. We could do, let's say the BR here, we could say img src is equal to chewy.jpg, and let's give it a width of 200 pixels, and the height is going to be automatically inherited. So whatever the aspect ratio is for a width of 200, it's going to have the proper height. And that didn't work because I spelled chewy wrong. Okay, so we've got this image over here, and like it's close, but it doesn't really look like a news website or like a newspaper would do it. We actually want the text to wrap around here. So what we can do is we can say style is equal to float, and then we can say float right. And what this is going to do is boom, move that image all the way to the right and have text flow around it, which is really, really nice. We can also say float left, and it does the exact same thing. Now we can also add some margin around here, margin 10 pixels, just so that we have some spacing around there. We could do border, 1 pixel solid black, and I'm doing internal CSS here. And then I could say, give this a box shadow, x-axis 0, y-axis 0. Let's make it blur by 5 pixels and make this black. And now we have some sort of image that actually sticks out. Now this is all internal CSS, and this is probably the most frowned way of writing CSS. So I'm gonna grab that, cut, delete it, and I'm gonna give this a class of floating image. And then if I go over to style.css, I can select that image with image.floating image. Alternatively, this would work as well. And I can just paste that in there. And so new line, move over there, new line. And if I did that right and I refresh this, nothing should change. Beautiful. And if I wanted to change that float, I could change that to right. Just like that. So that's how we sort of make images and content float side by side. Now, what do you think is going to happen if I have two images floating side by side like this? Well, let's take a look. They float side by side. They literally try to get as close to each other as possible. Now, there's a little bit of text in here, and so it's going to offset things as well, which is very, very interesting. So you might not get the exact outcome that you're looking for, but it can be very, very close. Now, the nice thing about this is floating image is going to be floating to the right. We can overwrite this with internal CSS, and this is a good case for internal CSS. We can say float left. There we go. That looks a little bit better. Now, I really want you to give this a shot. You're going to be using floats quite a bit until you get into significantly more advanced CSS. Floats are very, very important at this point in time in your development career or your development path, so make sure you are somewhat familiar with them. What you can do as another sort of fun example or something to play with is you can do an ordered list or an unordered list, an li, and you can put them all side by side. Or you can have div.float, and you can put these all side by side, make them float side by side. Go ahead, give that a shot. Don't feel like you need to master this one, but give it a shot, have some fun with it, and just sort of get some hands-on experience with how this one works. It's a little bit weird to get a hang of at first, but it's really good to tinker around with it and just, experiment. Okay, let's talk about your project. So your project here is going to be to go to rocketman.learnwagtail.com, and I want you to recreate the navigation and the hero section using what we've learned. I want you to recreate this. Now you can always go to that website and you can right-click, inspect, and see how I did all these different things, and that's going to get you pretty far, but it's not going to get you all the way. This particular page uses a different type of styling, uses a framework, it uses things like Flexbox, which we didn't necessarily learn, but there are ways around that. I'm going to leave that up to you to figure out how to get around more complex things by using simpler methods. And that's actually a really good thing to learn in web development. Always keep things as simple as possible. Now, this is not an easy project, and I'll just flip back here. This is not an easy project, but it's really, really good practice, and it uses everything we have learned in this course. So once again, this is not an easy project, but it is perfect practice. And the reason I say that is because one day, a designer is going to hand you a design and it's going to look something like this. And they're going to say, okay, now you have to code it. And you have to figure that out on your own. Now you can always go to rocketman.learnwagtail.com and you can see that right up here. But yeah, a designer is going to say, here's a design, make it happen. And you're going to have to try to make it happen. And you're not going to have very much guidance or support. And you're going to have to figure that out on your own. So this is really, really, really good practice. This is real life practice here. So go ahead, go to rocketman.learnwagtail.com, recreate the navigation and hero section using what we've learned. If you're like, oh, I don't have access to this particular image or this logo, that's okay. You can use your own logo. You can just Google something. You can throw any image in there that you want. It doesn't also have to be based on rockets. This is just a fun little website I made once upon a time. You can make it about coding, your favorite food, your favorite family member, your favorite hobby. It could be really anything, but recreate this layout and feel free to swap out the content, so the text that you see on here, or feel free to swap out the images or both. With that said, go ahead and give that a shot. Reference anything you need. Feel free to Google as much as you possibly need in order to get to the answers that you're looking for. And a lot of questions will come up, and that's totally normal, but feel free to Google your questions so that you can find the answers. And again, that's a big part of web development as well.